Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos, and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, join the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. G'day, welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. I believe this is episode number 32. My name's Matthew Cutler-Welsh and I'm coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How are things in Seattle, Zach?
They're good. I'm looking at plum blossoms across the street and enjoying some sunshine and at times, and it's good. It's spring.
Sounds lovely.
After the long, dark winter.
Yeah, which we're just going into. We've got the leaves are starting to turn. I quite like, as we call it, autumn.
Yeah.
You might call it fall. Have had a bit of condensation on the windows a couple of nights because we don't live in a passive house, unfortunately. So you're definitely getting some evidence of that clearly showing. It won't be long before we have to go and find the heaters and drag them out as well. So things are starting to cool down.
Yep. You have single pane windows?
Yep, all the way around. 1952, I think this house was made. It's timber, has been insulated a little top up of insulation in the attic space. We put some in under the floors. I doubt that most of the walls are insulated, so it's a fairly typical Australian or New Zealand timber framed and timber clad house.
Right.
And it's cold and it's drafty. I did put a blower door on the door once a few years ago, but I basically had to close off half the house in order to even get up to 50 pascals because otherwise it was just, I was going to need more than one fan to get there. So that's an indication of how leaky the house is, and it's no different from every other house on our street,
right,
or in our neighborhood.
Right. It's the old school version of inside outside connection, right there.
Yeah, we're very well connected to the outside. I know exactly what the weather's doing outside when I wake up in the morning, which is not a good place to be. Let's get into this week, but before we do, we've got some people to thank.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything we do at the Accelerator comes thanks to support from our sponsors. So I want to give a shout out to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxtingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA. So thank you to all of our sponsors.
I think I need one of those all-in-one HVAC and dehumidification because, we have to run a dehumidifier down here where I'm recording right now in the winter because it gets pretty damp down here and cold.
Wow. Yeah. Well, we're, with all the wildfire smoke, we're thinking about some sort of filtered fresh air system for our house, which is also not passive house. You
know what I have been noticing and super exciting with some of the topics in the happy hour and the Tech Tuesday is just these number of retrofit projects that seem to be being talked about, which is inspiring and making me think about the idea of a deep retrofit and how I would go about doing that. It's a bit overwhelming, but it's something that I'm very, very interested in. So just tuck that away, and I'll keep thinking about it.
Yeah, we can have a special podcast series about your experience.
I would imagine that would be a whole separate series, and it would be about a 12-month journey because it would be quite a project. Anyway, let's talk about this week's guest. Kate Nason. We're going back to Australia again, and also back to the Australian Passive House Association, where I've had a few great interviews recently, and it's been really awesome connecting with some of those people. So, Kate Nason. Kate is a certified passive house designer in Melbourne. She works for the international environmental design consultancy Atelier 10. She's also a director of partnerships and major events on the board of the Australian Passive House Association and a part-time tutor at the University of Melbourne. Having had various architectural roles since graduating from her master's degree, Kate has collected a range of experiences, including working on some of Australia's earliest passive house projects. I caught up with Kate to talk about her journey into architecture, how she discovered passive house, and her vision for the future of her industry in Australia. Let's start at the beginning, Kate. Why architecture? How did you get into architecture?
I think it was one of those things that just sort of evolved. I didn't really know what I wanted to be until someone actually said, that this was an option. So as a kid, I was always drawing house plans on the grid paper, and I think a lot of what influenced me was actually my dad was a civil engineer, and we, as a kid up to the age of about 10, we moved around quite a lot to different countries. So I started off in the UK and then moved to Switzerland for 5 years, and then moved to Singapore for 1.5 years, and then ended up in Australia. So I actually had quite a sort of a broad exposure to different buildings and different, cultures, and the way that would impact the design of the buildings. And this was all subconscious at the time, but I think it really impacted me in the fact that in Switzerland it was, there was a foot of snow outside. That probably doesn't happen very often anymore.
Yeah.
In the valley, and you'd be in, socks and T-shirts, or barefoot and T-shirts inside. I think that had a profound impact on me, that you could be so comfortable in such extreme conditions. And obviously, moving to Singapore, that was sort of a very, I think, a British influence on the building code. So all the fixtures and fittings were quite dated from when we went to, from say, Switzerland. And then when we came to Australia, it was like, wow. Absolutely freezing. We, in summer they had sales for Ugg boots, and I'm like, why does anyone need these, snow boots in the country where it doesn't snow, apart from in the, snowies? And June came around, and in Sydney this was, and we're like, we all have to get a pair of Ugg boots because we're just so bloody uncomfortable inside.
So you'd come back from the snow in Switzerland, and then the hot, humid environment of Singapore, and then you find yourself in Australia, which most people think of being very hot.
Perfect temperature, actually. It's sort of most of the year is 24 degrees, and
but it's not.
No, there's always those dips.
And you get cold.
Yeah. And now I'm in Melbourne, so that's a whole nother kettle of fish. We're just a bit further south than in Sydney, and it gets pretty cold down here. And I mean, not on, say, the North American standards of cold, but you definitely feel it, and you definitely feel quite vulnerable in the housing here, which is single glazing, and I think they're a bit better down here in Melbourne than even in Sydney. But it's pretty uncomfortable most of the year, which, I think as a kid sort of coming into that environment, it was just sort of this shock. And
I think that's a really good term that you use, vulnerable, which is not what you should feel inside your home.
No, not at all.
It should be a place of shelter, but that's true, I think, for a lot of people. They do feel vulnerable because they're worried about what's growing or just not being protected properly by their house.
And in Sydney, we had those extreme heat waves, which would go for, a week and a bit, and the temperature wouldn't cool off at night. So you just couldn't cool your buildings. And we were in a house in the suburbs, single glazing, west facing windows, no overhangs, like single brick. And it was literally an oven. And, you'd go through a heat wave, and I think it was New Year's Day. So everyone had their air conditioner on, and the power would go out for the whole suburb, just gone all day. And you think, as sort of the fit and healthy range of people, you were really struggling in that environment at 46 degrees is not very pleasant. And if the house is actually exacerbating that, it's probably hotter inside than it is outside. You think if you're an elderly person or someone with a chronic illness, or even your pets, who just can't deal with the heat, you just suddenly feel so vulnerable in that scenario.
It's only going to get worse because the temperatures are getting more extreme, and you've got an aging population. So those two are coming together, and I guess it added to that, you've got more and more people using reverse cycle air conditioners and trying to cool down mechanically, so that you already got the winter demand there, the winter peaks of the energy consumption, but you're getting more and more summer peaks as well of energy use.
Yep, definitely. It's we know the solution to this. It's just that the standard market still thinks that 6-star NatHERS is king. And that, if they buy a house or an apartment that reaches that standard, that they're buying something really, really high quality. The place that we literally just moved out of, I bumped into one of my neighbours who just bought a place in that building, and he was like, yeah, but it's a 6-star building. It's fabulous. You have no idea what we could be getting if we just.
So NatHERS, that's your national home energy rating scheme, and it's a requirement, right? So it's nothing particularly special to have a rating, because everything has to have a rating.
That's right, and 6 is the minimum. And we could probably talk for like 5 days about the software behind it, but
we could do a separate session on HERS ratings.
It's comparing apples and oranges when you look at passive house. It doesn't consider air tightness, thermal bridging. It doesn't consider different types of materials, like what impact thermal mass does or doesn't have on their rating.
So it's very cursory.
It is, and it gets the whole
sort of insulation levels and those.
Yeah, it does. And glazing ratios, and it's sort of a room by room or apartment by apartment scenario. But it's good to get everyone to a certain level, sure. And it's widely used, and it's good that we've got something like that. But it's by no means on the international standard very good at all.
But I think you raise a good point that there's a marketing issue there, because a lot of the vast majority of the main consumers in the whole industry use that as the benchmark, and it's got really great brand awareness. Everyone knows about it in Australia. So they just see it as the measure, where anyone who's actually looked at it from a building science point of view sees lots and lots of holes in it.
100%. And it's sort of trusted as well. And it's backed by the government. So people think, well, that's the solution, really. But it has been, we've had a bit of a success story up in New South Wales, where BASICs, or basics, however you want to say it, is sort of the code requirement for to get a building permit. So that includes a NatHERS rating, and it includes, a water tank and some other, sustainability criteria in that scorecard. Down here,
and that's Sydney only, right?
That's New South Wales, and then in Victoria, different countries, we have BEFs and some other sort of rating tools that we use as well. But in New South Wales, they've managed to get PHPP as an alternative compliance route rather than NatHERS. So you can use it rather than having to do PHPP on your passive house building and then do a NatHERS rating. You can just do PHPP, and that's recognised now. So that is a huge win, and we're trying to get the other sort of states on board with this alternative compliance solution as well. because it will make our life easier.
How did that come about? Is that something that the Australian Passive House Association was involved
Definitely,
in? Or is it just sort of driven more by the industry?
It was driven by mainly Andy Marlowe from our, he was on the board until recently.
Previous guest on the show.
Previous guest on the show.
Yep.
Awesome human being in general, and he's done a lot of work behind the scenes with this kind of policy and regulation stuff. And it just takes one person in government that you get to know, you have a trusted relationship with, and they can drive huge change. So it's connecting the right dots. I mean, I'm sure we've all had an experience where it just takes one person in the right place to really make things happen. And it was I believe it was Rob Stokes that really helped this situation, and a whole bunch of other sort of policy changes as well. There's probably lots of other people involved, but
sure.
Just
but
takes
it's a bit of an and I think getting more people exposed to PHPP like that, even if it's just a cursory part or an option, is a really big step forward because it opens people's eyes to what's possible.
Yeah.
Let's go back in to your story. So you came back to Australia. You trained in architecture in Australia.
That's right. I did all my study at the University of Technology in Sydney. So I think, in high school I just realised that, I loved art, and I loved, we were introduced to Frank Lloyd Wright and all of those sort of superstars. And I just thought, this is, I can do this as a job. I can draw houses for a job. This is awesome. So I went and did architecture, and it was very conceptual, I have to admit. There was a bit of sustainability in there, but again, it was more of a retrofit to the course at the time. I believe that is changing drastically now. But it was never really a focus, but I was always drawn to it, whether that was, looking at social sustainability or environmental sustainability, a very broad brush kind of principles though. And it wasn't until I really moved to Melbourne where I got thrown onto a passive house project that the penny dropped about building physics and how much I didn't know. And I'd worked in the industry for about 6 years by then. And, ever since, I think I joined a firm when I was 20, just doing part-time work while I was studying. So I'd been exposed to the way architecture firms were run and the sort of level of drawing and detailing, products that were being used. So I worked for companies like Grimshaw, Sarns in Sydney, and a few others as well along the way. And I honestly thought that, I was sort of across the detailing, and that we were designing really good buildings, and we were in a lot of respects. But I think as soon as you learn about some of these really basic principles of building physics and how they're ignored by the building code, then it's a big wake up call. And it was like I felt like I had to relearn everything.
Do you remember what that project was that you were on?
Yes, it was the Gillies Hall. So I'm sure a lot of people would know about it. The Monash Student Housing Project, CLT, passive house, first large-scale passive house building in Australia. So I was
Australasia, even
probably Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah, I think it was one of the first non-single standalone passive houses in the region.
Yeah.
So it was quite a
huge
big,
learnings.
Learning for everyone, learning for the whole industry. But that's interesting because it wasn't something that you said, "Oh, there's a passive house, I want to go and do it." It was you were sort of in the right place at the right time.
Moved down to Melbourne for my partner's work, really. So it was sort of a make of the best of a challenging situation, and getting out of your comfort zone. So I joined JCB Architects, and they said they did a lot of university work, and they had a CLT building up their sleeve, and I always wanted to work on one of them because that's sustainable, right? And then I started, and I believe it was my first day, and Simon Topless just put this the drawings on my desk and said it was sketch design at that point, and he said, "Oh, by the way, it's also this thing called passive house, but we'll be fine." And that night I went home, did a bit of research. I'm like, holy moly, like we are in for a rough ride here.
So had that come from the client had said that they wanted a passive house building?
Funnily enough, my my director now, David Ritter, was working with Monash the very early stages before Gillies Hall even became a project to work on their cross-campus sustainability sort of pathway to net zero by 2030. And so Passive House sort of crept in there as one of the project requirements. They'd already done a retrofit of one of their existing buildings. So this was going to be their poster child of like, we did it. So there was a lot of pressure from the client. It was, no was not an answer. We had to do Passive House. So,
and this firm that you were working for had got the contract because of their experience working with university type buildings, not because of any.
That's right, which is great because it means that anyone can do this. Like we all have the capability to do it. We just have to sort of build the capacity within our teams, and that's all it is. It's education. It's just sort of going out on a limb and just doing the training, learning from other people. The collaborative nature of the Passive House, I'd say, movement is the reason why it's so successful, I think, because we just share learnings with each other. We share our mistakes.
How did that go? From that moment, you went home, you did a bit of research. I'm guessing that there was no Passive House designer at the time in that office.
No.
So did you quickly become the Passive House person?
I did put forwards, that one of us should go on the course. This is the best way to sort of ensure we're up to speed. But we were working with a consultant called he was Pablo at ACOM, and he's done a few presentations. I believe at the last conference, really good. Go back and watch them. He was our Passive House consultant, and so he was actually the sort of driving force behind getting this to stack up in PHPP, and we were sort of being led by him in many ways. But there was sort of this butt against the traditional way to design a building and this PHPP, which was telling us that things weren't working. So I was sort of the middle person in this process, just trying to coordinate the design and I guess help it to add up in the calculations. And there was a bit of redesign involved, as you can imagine, because it was, the massing was shuffled a bit and the shading was obviously developed and window to wall ratios. All of that was, a really collaborative, a really interesting process. And I was just so fascinated by how a spreadsheet could be telling us like how this building would genuinely perform, and it wasn't a finger to the wind. Cross ventilation will solve all our problems. It was technical. It was backed up, and the more research I did, the more convinced I was that this was the way that we should, be designing buildings. At the time, there wasn't really literally the time or the sort of understanding within the firm that this course would actually propel them in this direction. I don't think at that point in time this was something that they might explore in other projects. Since then, it has changed. Danielle has done the training. And they've got some cool stuff up their sleeves now in terms of Passive House. So it's funny how quickly, like within a company, that can evolve. I actually decided to pursue a different direction in my career. I wanted to get to know the building side much more. So I joined a design and construct firm called Archit, who were exploring prefabricated solutions. And that was where I saw a huge opportunity, because obviously it was a mechanism to deliver these buildings. Designing them was one thing, but delivering them in a cost-effective, just logical way was quite another. So I worked for them for a few years, developing their Passive House sort of modular system. And they're still doing some really, really cool stuff.
Which, I mean, that was sort of 2018. It's still it was and still is kind of relatively early days in Australia and New Zealand of prefab Passive House.
Definitely. There's only really very small number, probably 2 that are sort of, or 2, 3, maybe even 4 now. It's really increased. And as as the Passive House Accelerator knows, prefab is a brilliant solution to delivering these types of buildings, and you've done whole summits on it. So it's still very early days, I think, in Australia compared to, say, Canada. But there's huge potential there. Huge potential.
What's the resistance? Like, why is everyone not doing it?
I think it's it's challenging in single resi. Again, it's just market education. They don't really know what they don't know, and trying to upsell them on this specification that they don't understand the benefits of is really difficult. Yep. And by the time you've sort of explained it all to them, they've normally already settled on a price that they've sort of market tested, and they're like, no, we're not going over that. So it's to do with price normally, but that's a whole nother topic.
Which you've talked about on the Accelerator Happy Hour session, done great presentations there already, so people should go and check that out.
Yeah, there's and some sites as well are trickier than others, as we know. So there's, I think, the market understanding is growing, and the capacity and capability of the builders is also growing rapidly. And so I think, in terms of what's happening, there's lots happening behind the scenes that no one's quite screaming and shouting about yet. So
let's look forward to hearing more.
Yes.
Now you're giving back quite a lot. You're still teaching. You've gone back and still tutoring or teaching, but also a board member at the Australian Passive House Association. How did that come about?
Again, it was sort of towards when I was doing a lot of research in the Passive House realm, and I realised that there was this Australian Passive House Association. So I was like, that's something I need to get involved with in some way, shape, or form. And so I went to one of the conferences back in 2018, and I was completely blown away by the friendliness of everyone. I didn't know a single soul there, and I came out with loads of friends, and also just hearing people talk about these amazing projects, and everyone was on the same page. I felt like I'd found my people. So I just continued to go to events and sort of I joined a technical working group because at the time, I'd had a bit of experience with Passive House, and I thought, well, there's not a lot of experience, but it seems to be, enough to warrant joining a group and maybe learning off other people. So it was just a good way to sort of get involved and try and give something back as well. So I joined that with Marcus Strang, who was the working group leader, and from there it just kind of flourished. I realised that an old friend, Andy Marlowe, up in Sydney, was on the board, and it, one conversation led to another, and he said, "There's, board opening. You should apply." And I just looked at him and said, "There's no way that I'm capable of doing that." But again, International Women's Week, encouraging, I guess, probably the younger cohort of people, and being a female, he encouraged me to just step up, and that's the kind of sort of championing that we need in the industry, because I don't have as much experience as some people, and I didn't think I could do it, but it's a really friendly sort of cohort of people anyway. So I just stepped up, and it's been a lot of fun, and it is what you want to make it. So I encourage anyone to just step out of your comfort zone and give it a go.
Nice. Where do you see things going from here in terms of Passive House in Australia? And you also mentioned that now with your work at Atelier 10, you're working offshore as well. You're still physically in Australia for probably for a little while. but now advising across shores all the way back to Europe. But where do you see things going in Australia with regards to passive house in the next, say, 5 years?
It's really exciting. So now that I'm more on the consulting side, so we do, sort of ESD consulting or, a lot of passive house consulting now as well, which is very exciting. The interest from architecture firms, from, these big scale companies is really promising, and the fact that they're sending people on courses, and as you may be aware, the Australian Passive House Association now runs courses as well, and we've just had complete sellout. The designer course,
super popular.
So popular, and we still have Box Hill, and we still have Daniel Kress at a Smart Plus Academy, and they're all full as well. So it's really, really promising to seeing the numbers, but also just speaking to, we share an office with an architecture firm, and, their basic knowledge of passive house is pretty good, not just because, we sit next to them, but they're just, the litmus test for the rest of the architectural sort of industry here in Melbourne anyway, that are really getting up to scratch on just at least the basics. They understand the benefits, and most of them are pretty hungry to give it a go. And I think it takes, firms like JCB, who hadn't been, known for passive house before the Gillies Hall, to go, what, they did it, we can do it. So I think that's been, that project in itself has been huge, a huge sort of, it's created a groundswell of interest.
And I guess having good clients like that ask for it and demand it helps.
Yeah,
well.
I think the first few, the ones that are really the groundbreakers, the client really does need to be on board, because if the client just goes, oh, this is just a bit of, we're putting, X amount of, I think the cost actually just comes from the extra consulting work. You're doing a PHPP model, you're doing just a bit extra, but how I like to explain it is, rather than say some of the other rating schemes, you're not paying for the label. The label is actually the cheap bit on a passive house. The plaque is cheap in relative cost, but you're putting the money, it's all the work, which is what you're actually getting, the performance, not just a label on your building. So I think people are starting to really understand that, and that the performance outcomes are far superior to anything they would get from just going down a really a highly marketed rating scheme route.
Are you still on the tools? Do you still get to use PHPP?
I do, yes. It's been a really exciting year of being trapped in my lounge room, but I've used it. Been in the background learning. Being thrown in the deep end on quite complex projects on PHPP. So, it's a fantastic tool, and I never thought I'd, as an architect, be so excited about a spreadsheet. But
it's a far cry from drawing pictures
really
and getting paid to sketch houses. But you obviously enjoy doing it. Is being an architect different from what you imagined it would be?
I think the two just marry up really nicely, because if you because you obviously plug in the geometry into PHPP, and there's a 3D element behind it, I guess, like it's probably in your imagination or in SketchUp or whatever you're using, but there's a tangible, for me, a tangible sort of visual that I'm getting from that spreadsheet. The wall compositions, they're just line items in this spreadsheet, but I can see them, I can imagine them, and I can imagine how they're built because of the experience that I had before. So it's just kind of the icing on the cake for me to be able to use this tool and advise architects on their designs and how to optimize them. Really, it's really exciting, and I get to work across a whole range of buildings now, rather than just one that may or may not come across my desk, because you're in
Nice.
one company. So now I feel like I've got a little foot in a lot of different architectural firms because I'm working with them, which is exciting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Consulting with other
Yeah.
designers. Awesome. Hey, well done for all the great work you've done. It's fantastic to have people like you around. I've got full confidence in your abilities, and I think you're a very, very worthy person to be on the board, because it's not just about technical experience, but that experience of being willing to lead and go where you see things being positive as well. Making those decisions to say this is what I want to do, and I'm gonna go here. So that's inspiring for other
it's
people.
Just having confidence. Just have confidence that your direction is the right direction, and just taking the next step in towards that North Star or whatever it is you're heading towards, and just keeping your compass on track. And I guess for International Women's Day, I guess the topic is choose to challenge. So I choose to challenge all the other sort of young females in our industry who, for whatever reason, feel like they can't step up, or that their voice isn't as well heard. Just do it. Get out your comfort zone, and you'll really surprise yourself. And
Nice.
It comes from within.
Nice. Thank you very much, Kate.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And that was Kate Nason there, currently of Atelier 10, and she is also Director of Partnerships and Major Events on the board of the Australian Passive House Association. How did you like that interview, Zach?
Well, it was awesome. And Kate has kind of taken the passive house world by storm the last couple of years with her international travels and study around passive house, and sharing. We need to share in show notes the report that she produced based on that, with policy insights and other passive house insights from all over the world. And of course, we've had her on the happy hour. She's really, really inspiring. And her closing with the choose to challenge, and her challenging of other young women in the industry to just do it and get out of the comfort zone and step up. Was inspiring. And she's a model for that kind of leadership and the impact that one person can have on the industry. So it's really great stuff.
Yeah, I kind of was drawing it out a little bit, that we shouldn't take for granted that just by going through architecture school, you're going to learn not necessarily about passive house, but even just what we would consider as good sustainable design. And there might be a subject thrown in there about sustainable design, but who knows what if it's ticking a box, or if it's really well researched, really well put together course. A lot of people like Kate who are coming out and moving into this field and then becoming leaders in the industry are doing that largely off their own back and their own motivation. Maybe they pick up something somewhere, but then they have to actually actively go and seek the training, and then they might find a project, but they say yes to it. It's not something that is being spoon-fed. It's something that people are having to work to go and find out about and to do. So I just really want to acknowledge people like Kate and a lot of the other guests that we've had, not just from this part of the world, but from everywhere, who have been pioneers really and had to work, but now looking back, we see them as doing all this great work, which seems obvious looking back in retrospect, but wasn't necessarily at the time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Also, the ripple effect that can happen when, like, a client decides to insist on an architecture 2030 goal, or meaning, and passive house, and the unforeseen impact that can have on individual people like Kate, and she talked about the Gillies Hall project and how it was so formative for her, and where she got this, it was placed on her desk, the initial drawings, and then she heard about and oh, by the way, it's gonna be Passive House. She went home and looked up Passive House and said, we're in for a rough ride here. But then then she had the takeaway that actually we did it, and anyone can do this. We need to just train our teams. But one of the things that I've been, and I mentioned before we started our conversation, I mentioned the How to Save a Planet podcast, which I've been really enjoying. And there was just a episode about the debate between whether individual action about one's own carbon footprint makes a difference and is important, or is it just systemic change that we need to be looking at, and there are different ways of looking at that. And of course, individual action, actually, if you look at the numbers, is like it's such a tiny, what we can do is so tiny compared to the magnitude of the problem, right? But for those of us in the passive house world or in the design and construction world, we have this opportunity when we do projects like Gillies Hall, or join the board of Australian Passive House Association and get a grant to go around and do studies and things. We have the privilege of being able to really have an impact on the larger industry through individual action. And so it's I think that's like one of the takeaways from that episode was just, if you're able to get out one circle or two circles from yourself with action, then that's making a big impact. So I was just thinking about the parallels and how amazing, how as daunting as the challenges are around climate change and how that can be frustrating and depressing sometimes. Also, this amazing opportunity that we all have to be making an outsized impact because of kind of just where we are in the transition to passive house and high performance building.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And that argument is often used in places like New Zealand. There are people who say that our impact on the global emissions is so tiny because we're only 5 million people down in the South Pacific. And I say, well, yeah, we could say the same about rugby. We could say the same about sailing. We just won the America's Cup. We could choose to have an impact that is much bigger than ourselves, not necessarily directly in the numbers, but how that ripple effect happens. And we show what can be done in our small space, then others can learn from that. And that is true, certainly, for the building industry, where we can show with buildings that how they can impact positively the people on the planet, and then others will look at that and it ripples out from there. So I think it's a great thing for people to keep in mind, and to not be disheartened by, is this one project going to make any difference? Absolutely, it can make a difference, because think of all the thousands of people that, particularly if it's somewhere like a university, all the people that are going to come and spend time there and go, wow, there's something different about this building. What is it?
Yeah, no, it's so true.
You mentioned Kate talked about NatHERS and a bit of jargon. I think we have mentioned NatHERS on the show in the past. That is the National Australian Home Energy Rating Scheme. A bit of a mouthful. The National Home Energy Rating Scheme. You can have a look at that if you're interested. It's similar to Energy Star that people might be familiar with. Basically, it's a standardized process. It gets a little bit of flack from passive house community because it's made for the mass market, so it's very simplified, and PHPP basically blows it out of the water in terms of accuracy and its usefulness. But it's a watered down version of some type of an energy rating for buildings.
Yeah, and Andy Marlowe came, who was a guest on the show a few weeks ago, cropped up a couple times in the conversation, and partly because of his policy advocacy leadership in in seeing through that change in New South Wales, where PHBP is now an alternative compliance pathway. So
yeah,
another person leveraging their individual action for greater good.
Yeah,
good stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. What have we got going on in Passive House World this coming week?
Yeah, so at the Accelerator, we have a Construction Tech Tuesday, which is Wednesday in New Zealand and Australia. Will feature Scott Farbman, a building performance analyst. He will be talking about the first FIAS rehab project in Chicago. So FIAS being Passive House Institute US. So check that out. Should be great. And then on Wednesday, we have 3 guests for the Global Passive House Happy Hour. Shannon Pendleton, who's been playing a role as the co-host at the Construction Tech recently. Ilka Cassidy, who listeners of the podcast will recognize as the guest co-host of with Mary James a couple of weeks ago, and they'll be doing a new episode very soon. And Angela Iraldi, so they'll be talking about a Passive House project that they worked on together. And as always, lots going on in the educational space and other socials and stuff that we'll share in show notes.
Awesome. Lots going on as always. Thank you for another great episode, Zach. I'm pleased that life is kind of returning to some sense of normality for you guys over there.
Yeah, it is. It is in many ways, political and epidemiological.
May that continue.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and really appreciate the time that you spend with us, not just in this podcast, but all the other activities and the great sessions that put on by the Passive House Accelerator. We'll be back again next week with another interview on the Passive House podcast.